The harbor belongs to Rome now, and the harbor does not yet know it. The lagoon has drawn back from the wall, leaving mud and weed upon the stones. A few hours ago, New Carthage stood guarded by sea and lagoon on 3 of its sides, and only the narrow landward wall looked open to assault. Then the tide turned, as tides do, asking no one's leave. Roman troops waded the shallow lagoon, found the battlements above it thinly held, and came into the city by the one side that everyone had agreed was safe. Now the captured city is being counted, and counting is its own kind of conquest. Prisoners and artisans, hostages and ships and silver, all passing under Roman hands, the great Punic capital of Spain reduced in a morning to a Roman inventory. 18 ships are added to Scipio's fleet. Spanish metalworkers are taken into Roman service, and the hostages by which Carthage held the loyalty of the Iberian peoples are held now by Rome instead, which is to say that the loyalty itself has changed its keeper. The year is 209 before our era. Publius Cornelius Scipio took the city, and in the harbor the work is bookkeeping, the storehouse, the hostages, the dockyard, and the road the silver traveled, all passing into Roman keeping. The war in Spain is not finished, and Hasdrubal will still slip out of the peninsula after Baecula. But from this morning onward, Carthage's western war has lost something that no treasury can buy back, and the record of all this must be handled like the old document it is. For almost every surviving written source for this war is Roman or written for Roman readers. Polybius is the strongest ancient guide, and he had rare access, through the Scipio family, through Laelius, through Massinissa himself. Such access is worth having, and it stands him close to one side of the war he describes. So the narration follows the ancient voices through modern hands, and keeps their loyalties always in view, the way a careful man keeps a lamp between himself and the dark. Scipio came to Spain because 2 older Scipios had died there, and their dying had left a door no one else would walk through. His father and his uncle had carried the Spanish war for years, and in 211 they were defeated and killed. The younger Publius Cornelius Scipio stood outside every normal path of command. No office above curial aedile, never consul, never praetor. Rome gave him proconsular command anyway, as a private citizen, and the gift was as strange as it sounds, for Rome did not hand its armies to young men without titles. It did so once here, and the once was enough to change the war. The army he inherited had been forged in the years after Cannae, and it carried the marks of the forging. After the disaster of 216, the Roman light troops had been remade, their number in each legion doubled. The change was practical, as the deepest changes often are: more screening, more missiles, more men who could move before the heavy infantry closed. The heavy infantry would still close with the enemy, as Roman infantry had always done. It would no longer be asked to carry the whole battle on its own shoulders. Scipio took that lesson and drilled it into the bodies of his men. The legions practiced the fixing attack, and the column moving out toward the flank, and the cavalry stroke against the wing, envelopment, pursuit, and the recovery after pursuit, which is the hardest discipline cavalry ever learns. None of it was parade work. Men had to hear orders through dust, turn without dissolving, leave one line for another, and come back while the fight still needed them. An army learns such things the way a smith's hand learns the hammer, by 10,000 repetitions, until thought is no longer required. New Carthage changed even what the soldiers carried in their hands. Among the prisoners of the city were Spanish swordsmiths, and they were set to work for Rome. By the time Scipio sailed for Africa, his army carried the Spanish gladius, the short sword of the peninsula, and had been schooled in its use. The lesson should not be passed over as a quartermaster's note. Tactics live in bodies, drills, and blades long before they live in histories, and an empire's fortunes can turn on the temper of a smith's fire. The ships mattered in the same bodily way. New Carthage yielded 18 vessels, raising Scipio's fleet to 48, and it yielded craftsmen skilled in metal and the making of war gear. Beneath the painted victory lies a ledger: captured ships repaired, captured craftsmen assigned, captured silver redirected, captured hostages turned into quiet political coin. Wars are won in such ledgers more often than the songs admit. Baecula gives the first clear sight of the new method at work. Scipio held the Carthaginian force by the front while stronger infantry swung toward the wings. It worked, and it did not work wholly, for Hasdrubal drew his army out of Spain after the battle and lived to march again. The result was no clean piece of theatre. It was a lesson, and like most true lessons, it was paid for and incomplete at once. At Ilipa, the movement grew deliberate, and the deliberateness was the mastery. The Iberian center came on slowly, refusing the first collision, while Roman infantry and cavalry moved fast against the Carthaginian wings and then turned in upon the flanks. The center no longer had to be the whole battle. The wings could now decide what the center was for, and the old grammar of the battlefield was being rewritten while the Carthaginians watched. After Ilipa, Spain ceased to be what it had been for the House of Barca, the deep well from which armies were drawn. The peninsula no longer offered Carthage its manpower, and it no longer offered Hasdrubal a road toward a second great descent upon Italy. After Ilipa, the next campaign could be imagined across the water. Carthage had lost more than a battle in Spain. It had lost the country that made its armies, and a war without a source of men is a war already turning toward its end. The next movement led across the water, and the argument for it was old and simple. Scipio's reasoning would have fitted on a wax tablet: threaten Carthage at her own walls, and Hannibal must either leave Italy or let his city face the danger without him. The African campaign was a lever set under the whole Italian war, and Scipio meant to lean on it until something moved. Africa was no empty board waiting for Roman and Carthaginian pieces. Africa had kings of its own, and the kings had horsemen. Syphax was wealthy, and he could raise troops, and most of his troops were cavalry of the first quality. He knew the Carthaginians, and he knew the country around them as a man knows his own fields. His friendship meant horsemen, roads, forage, warning, and knowledge of the land, and both of the great powers came courting him for it. Massinissa brought a different coin to the table. He had commanded cavalry for Carthage in his time, and now he needed Roman help in the struggle for his own throne, and in return for that help he offered Rome his troops. The alliance was not gratitude dressed in noble colors. It was a bargain struck inside a dynastic war by a prince who could count, and such bargains, honestly made, have outlasted many friendships. Carthage worked the same ground from the other side, and worked it well. Hasdrubal Gisco labored to draw Syphax away from Scipio, and the marriage of Sophonisba sealed what the labor had begun. Later writers hung tragedy and romance upon the woman, as later writers will. The fact beneath the drapery is colder. Syphax no longer held himself bound to Rome, and one of the supports beneath Scipio's African design had been pulled away before the first Roman keel touched African water. Massinissa stayed in the Roman column because Rome could make him a king, and he never pretended otherwise. That plainness does not shrink him in the story, it sets him where the light falls. The cavalry that will come back at Zama in the last hour is no ornament fixed to a Roman victory. It is the harvest of African politics, of a disputed kingship, and of a prince who understood to the last denarius what Roman friendship could buy. So cavalry in this war was never only an arm of battle. It was an alliance system on horseback. Syphax could bring riders, and Massinissa could bring riders. Carthage labored to bind the one, and Rome held the other. And when Roman and Numidian squadrons rode too far in pursuit at Zama, the question hanging over the field was not whether cavalry could win a fight. It was whether the politics that had brought the horsemen to the field could bring them back in time. Before Scipio could carry the war to Africa, he had to carry it through Rome, and Rome was the harder country. Hannibal still stood on Italian soil, and Fabius Maximus and the older senators raised the objection that needed no rhetoric. To send a Roman army across the sea while Hannibal remained in Italy was to gamble with the homeland itself. The Senate refused Scipio a new army. It allowed him volunteers and left him to build upon the legions already in Sicily, and among those legions stood the survivors of Cannae, men who had lived for years under the shadow of a disgrace that was not theirs. Then came the trouble at Locri. An ugly affair there, touching Scipio's command, gave his enemies the opening they had waited for, and Fabius pressed to have him recalled, and the invasion stopped in the harbor. A commission went south, looked, and found Scipio innocent. Only then did the Senate set its seal upon the attack on Africa, and the seal was given grudgingly, as great ventures are often licensed by the men who doubt them. And the Senate scene should give Fabius his due, for he was not wrong to be afraid. The African campaign wears the look of destiny now because it succeeded. In 205, it was a disputed wager, a transfer of danger from one shore to another with no promise attached. Hannibal lived. The towns of Italy had carried the war on their backs for a decade and more. Scipio's answer was to lift the center of the war out of Italy altogether and set it down at the gates of Carthage, and no man could yet say whether the lifting would save Rome or maim it. At Lilybaeum, the design became ships and stores, which is how all designs must end if they are to matter. 40 warships, 400 transports, food and water for 45 days, counted down to the last skin. The sea between Sicily and Africa was no blue stripe on a map. It was the whole operation, the road and the larder and the line of retreat in one. Rome had to land, stay fed across that water, and make Carthage feel the war inside her own fields. He landed near Utica in 204, and the first season did not go as the songs would have it. Carthage at first had no field army strong enough to meet him, and Scipio moved on Utica because a campaign must have a base, a port, a fortress, a way of staying alive through winter. Then Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Syphax came against him with a greater combined force, and Scipio drew back from Utica and dug himself a fortified camp by the Bagradas, and there the invasion sat, watching its own fires. For the invasion had not simply arrived and begun to win. It had landed, marched, laid siege, been checked, and stopped for the winter. The enemy had men enough to watch him, horsemen enough to punish every movement, and sense enough to join Carthaginian and Numidian strength into one system of camps. The next Roman victory would not begin with a battle line. It would begin with huts, and with what huts are made of. Through the winter, Scipio talked peace, and while the talking went on, his envoys used their eyes. The Carthaginian huts were built of wood and boughs, the Numidian huts were built of reeds. Men dressed as slaves walked the camps and studied the gates and the approaches. The enemy lay some 10 miles from Scipio's lines, and Hasdrubal's camp stood about a mile from Syphax's own. And all the while Scipio fitted out ships with siege engines, in plain sight, as though his whole mind were bent on blockading Utica from the sea. Before the night march, every report was weighed twice. Scipio called in the spies who had walked the enemy camps, and he set Massinissa over their answers, for who better to test a tale about a Numidian camp than a Numidian king? The plan was never only fire. It was distance, hut stuff, camp gates, a naval feint, and the judgment of an ally who knew what he was hearing. Fire was merely the signature at the bottom of the page. Under cover of night, Scipio divided his army, and the night did the rest. Laelius and Massinissa took the Numidian troops and half the infantry against Syphax's camp. Scipio led the remainder against Hasdrubal's. In the Numidian camp, men woke to fire and thought it an accident, and ran from their reed huts unarmed to fight the flames. Massinissa's men stood waiting at the gates they knew so well. Laelius' legionaries cut down those who came through. The fire asked no quarter, and none was given around it. Livy sets down 40,000 dead, and the number should be looked at twice. The modern reading puts the figure aside as past believing, and the truth needs no such number. Syphax escaped, and Hasdrubal escaped, each with a remnant, and their armies were broken all the same, unmade in a night by a plan built of observation, deception, dry timber, and darkness. There are victories of the sword and victories of the eye, and this one belonged to the eye. Carthage did not answer the disaster with one mind, for great cities seldom do. After the camps burned, some senators wanted peace, and some wanted Hannibal home, and some, the faction of the Barcid house, wanted the war pressed to the end. Hasdrubal and Syphax had escaped, and Carthage still had money, and money is an army not yet mustered. Survivors, fresh levies, and Celtiberian mercenaries were gathered into a new force before the Great Plains. At the Great Plains, Scipio played the Roman lines like the parts of one instrument. The Hastati of the front line went forward and fixed the enemy where he stood. The Principes and the Triarch behind them formed into columns, swung out from the shadow of the first line, and closed upon the Carthaginian flanks. The maneuver ran more sweetly than Zama would ever run. The first line held, the second and third lines moved, and the enemy was folded in and finished. It was Cannae's lesson, learned by the defeated and returned with interest. Syphax was taken, and with him fell the last weight in Africa's western scale. Numidia was neutralized, Carthage opened talks of peace, and envoys went over the sea to recall Mago and Hannibal. Then the truce broke, and it broke over ships and bread. A Roman convoy from Sicily was scattered by weather, and the transports were driven into the bay of Carthage, and a hungry city debated in its senate, and its assembly what to do with food that floated within reach. Hasdrubal towed the transports in. Roman envoys came to protest, received no proper answer, and were set upon as they sailed home. So the war began again, over cargo, weather, and a decision taken in a hungry city, which is how wars begin more often than the chronicles like to say. Hannibal left Italy in the autumn of 203. 15 years he had made his war on Roman ground, and he came home a man in his middle 40s, to a city he barely remembered and a war that had gone on without him. Mago never finished the same journey. He died of his wounds at sea, on the way back from Liguria, and the sea kept him. Before the battle, Hannibal and Scipio met between the camps, on the bare ground that belonged to neither. So much may be believed. The speeches may not, for Polybius and Livy each shaped them to his own purpose, writing inside traditions that needed the meeting to carry meaning, and the words of great men on the eve of great battles are the first things the chroniclers improve. The safer picture is the plainer one: two commanders, the attendants held back, the heat and the distance and the silence, and not one word between them that can now be trusted. The numbers are uncertain, and the uncertainty should be spoken with them. Following Polybius through the modern hands, Hannibal stood with some 36,000 foot, 4,000 horse, and 80 elephants, and Scipio with some 29,000 foot and 6,100 horse. The modern reading doubts the 80 elephants and would put 15 or 20 nearer the mark. The secure shape needs no decimals. Hannibal held the greater infantry and the beasts. Scipio, with Massinissa beside him, held the horse. Scipio set his army in order for the elephants before all else, for the elephants would come first or not at all. The maniples, the small blocks of Roman infantry, were not laid out in the old checkerboard. They stood one behind another, file behind file, so that pale lanes ran straight through the whole Roman army, front to rear, like streets cut through a town that did not yet know what would walk down them. Light troops stood as a screen across the gaps. Their orders were to give way when they must. The cavalry held the wings, and the trumpets and bugles waited with their breath drawn. The purpose was never to stop the great animals by weight, for no formation of men stops an elephant by weight. The purpose was to bewilder them, wound them, open roads for them, and send them down passages where their terror would spend itself on empty air. Across the field, Hannibal set his infantry in 3 lines, and the 3 lines were 3 ages of his war. Mago's mercenary veterans stood foremost. The levies of Carthage and the Greek phalanx infantry made the second line, and behind them all, held back from the first collision like a debt kept for the last accounting, stood the men of the Italian years, the old guard, the army that remembered Cannae. In cavalry, Hannibal was badly outmatched, and he knew it as well as any man on the field. So he turned the weakness into a tool, as he had turned weaknesses all his life. His horsemen were to draw the Roman and Numidian cavalry away, out and away from the infantry fight, and if Scipio's stronger squadrons chased far enough, the decision would fall to the foot soldiers in the center, where Hannibal's depth and his veterans might yet tell. The elephant charge was confusion from its first stride to its last. The Velites went forward with javelins and missiles, and the trumpets and bugles cried out together, and the great animals answered the noise as their nature bade them, not as Carthage did. Some panicked, some turned upon the light troops, some went down the prepared lanes and out the back of the Roman army, hurting no one, some swung wide toward the Roman right. Even the order of events in Polybius may stand reversed. What matters is what did not happen. The charge did not break the Roman infantry, and with that, the first of Hannibal's 3 weapons was spent. Then the cavalry left the center of the world. On both wings, the Roman and Numidian horse swept off in pursuit, and the pursuit drew them farther and farther from the ground, where the foot would decide everything. A modern reading counts this opening as Hannibal's first success, and the count is fair. Scipio owned the stronger cavalry, and for a long hour of killing, that strength was somewhere else. The infantry lines then closed upon one another, and neither commander got the battle he had drawn. Hannibal had pulled the cavalry away and had not destroyed it. Scipio had built his lanes and still had 3 lines of infantry to break with the strength of his own arm. So the center became a straight and grinding fight, line against line, push and wound and push again, the kind of battle both men had spent their lives learning how not to fight. Hannibal's first and second lines fought hard enough to disorder the whole Roman advance, and the disorder forced a thing rarely seen in ancient battle. Scipio halted in the open field between one struggle and the next. He drew what wounded he could to the rear, and he reformed his army into a single line, dressing the ranks while the dust settled, with Hannibal's old guard standing ahead of him, fresh, silent, and waiting. The army that had learned to move now showed that it had also learned to stop, and stopping under an enemy's eye is the harder art. Then the cavalry came back, and with it came the end. Laelius and Massinissa returned at the turning hour, and their squadrons broke upon the Carthaginian rear, while the last infantry struggle still hung in the balance. Hannibal had drawn the horsemen away, as he had designed. He had not kept them away long enough, and in that little measure of time, the war of 17 years was decided. And Massinissa belongs inside that final movement, not beside it. For the horsemen who struck the rear carried the whole Numidian story onto the field with them. Syphax and Massinissa, the disputed kingship, Roman courtship and Carthaginian counter-courtship, and the capture that had laid Numidia quiet. The last advantage at Zama was not Roman-made. It had been made in African politics, over years, before it was spent in African dust in an afternoon. This was not Cannae turned backward, whatever the symmetry lovers say. No Roman mass was drawn into a pocket. No Carthaginian cavalry closed a ring. No Spanish well of men stood behind Hannibal, refilling what the field drained. At Zama, Rome had changed the conditions around Hannibal before ever meeting him. Spain cut away, the Numidian horse turned, and a Roman infantry that could open lanes, halt, gather its wounded, and form again in the open field under an enemy's gaze. Hannibal was not beaten by his own old maneuver, and he was not beaten by a better general's trick. He was beaten by a war that had been moved around him, piece by patient piece. Carthagina, Ilipa, the African landing, the Numidian struggle, the broken truce, and at the last the cavalry's return. At Cannae, Hannibal had found the conditions he needed waiting for him on the field. At Zama those conditions were gone, and they had not wandered off. They had been taken from him, deliberately, one by one, over 11 years. The peace did not destroy Carthage. It did something quieter and longer. It left the city its African towns, its laws, and its freedom from a Roman garrison, and then it took away every instrument by which Carthage had ever acted beyond its own walls. The fleet was cut to 10 triremes. The elephants were given up. No war could be made without Rome's leave. Massinissa's claims were restored, hostages were handed over, and 10,000 talents were to be paid out across 50 years, a sum measured not in silver but in generations. A child born in the year of the peace would grow old while his city was still paying for the war. Then came the part that was made for the eyes. Scipio ordered the surrendered warships of Carthage taken out to sea and burned within sight of the city, hull after hull, the smoke standing on the water. No Roman garrison needed to sit inside Carthage while her navy burned outside it. The harbor, the treasury, the council chamber, and the hostage lists would keep the peace from that day forward, year upon year upon year, and they would keep it without a single Roman spear. Hannibal did not vanish into the smoke of those ships. In 196 he was elected Suffete, one of the chief magistrates of Carthage, and he set the city's finances in order so that the indemnity could be paid without starving the people. Mark the picture, for history offers few stranger ones. 6 years after Zama, the most feared enemy Rome ever knew was doing the patient work of a civic officer, under terms his enemy had written, and doing it well. In 195, the pressure came upon him from two sides at once. His enemies inside Carthage moved against him, and Rome pressed for his arrest. Hannibal left Africa and went east, beyond the present reach of the Roman settlement, and the rest of his life was spent among other men's courts. Antiochus first, then Crete, then Armenia, then Bithynia, each refuge a little smaller than the last. On the manner of his end, the sources do not agree, and around a famous death the tellings always multiply. Poison carried in a ring, poison in the wine, other versions still. Beneath the variants 1 point stands fast. Hannibal died in Bithynia in 183 by his own hand when capture had become certain. Rome had hunted him across 20 years and 3 kingdoms, and Rome never led him in a triumph. That last refusal was his, and he kept it. Scipio's ending belongs in the same quiet room of the story. Charges were brought against him in Rome, and he would not stoop to answer them. He withdrew to Litynum, and he did not return to conduct his defense, and there he died in 183, the same broad season of the world as his great enemy. His tomb stood at Litynum, away from Rome, though the city kept his statue. The conqueror of Hannibal would not be buried in the city he had saved, and the choice was his own. The pairing should not be polished into a fable, and yet it will not be put down. Hannibal died in Bithynia, far from the city he had fought for. Scipio died at Litynum, outside the embrace of the city he had fought for. Each man had been necessary to his state in the hour of danger, and when the danger passed, each stood at a distance from his city, and the distance was not an accident either time. States forget what they cannot bear to owe. The closing image holds two places in one frame, under the same late light. Litynum and Bithynia, a Roman villa away from Rome, and a foreign house where Hannibal could still keep Rome from arranging his body. And behind the two of them lie all the stations of the long road: the lagoon at New Carthage, the Spanish forges, the slow center at Ilipa, Syphax's court, the ships at Lilybaeum, reed huts burning in the dark, transports seized in a hungry city's bay, and cavalry returning across a plain at the 1 hour that mattered. Zama was a battlefield in 202 BC, and it was more than a battlefield. It gathered the long years after Cannae into one afternoon of dust and trumpets. Rome had learned how to survive Hannibal, and the lesson was not a maneuver. It was this: change the field around a great commander for long enough, and the day comes when his greatness has nothing left to stand on.